So, welcome everyone. My name is Dora. I'm one of the organizers of Qesher, and the other is Sebastian. You can find us both here. We started this project now 4 years ago, so time flies. I've been saying almost 4 years, but now it's really been 4 years that we have been doing this. And our aim has been to introduce different Jewish communities from all over the world. And I see a lot of familiar faces. So I know that you all know that, but if you are joining us for the first time, we want to give you a very warm welcome as well and just let you know a little bit about what we do. So out of this grew another series, which is the Qesher Book Club, which now we've been doing for about a year, in which we introduce books that are somehow related to this overall topic of learning about Jewish diaspora and their lives and their culture. And today we are very happy to cooperate with Drora Arusi, who is representing Jewish Unity Through Diversity Institute. And we've been doing these Qesher book clubs in cooperation with them. Some of you may have seen it on our registration form, or maybe if you attended last week, then you already met Drora. So today, just like last week, we're going to do this talk in the format of an interview. And then, of course, after the interview, which will be done by Drora, we will have time also for questions from the audience. So we will have about, 40 minutes or so for presentation and interview. And then after that, you'll have the chance also to ask questions. And now I'm going to introduce Dalia Abraham Klein, who is the author of today's book, which is called Caravan of Hope, a Bukharan woman's journey to freedom. Dalia is a writer on Central Asian Jewish history and Jewish values. Her articles have appeared on the Tablet, Chabad, Jewish Journal, and the Times of Israel. She's a teacher at Partners in Torah, offering a personalized learning experience on the system of life through Jewish wisdom. And Caravan of Hope is her fourth book. She's going to share a little bit about also her other books. So I'm going to just let Drora introduce herself, and I apologize for everyone, it's going to be confusing. We have Drora here doing the interview. My name is Dora, and also one of the characters of the book is called Dora.
And my middle name is Dora.
That's the theme of the day. We hope you can all follow through with all of us. So I just want to let Drora introduce just a few words about herself before we get into the presentation.
So I just want to say thank you to Sebastian and to Dora for doing this amazing series. I just think it's a wonderful concept. I hope everybody else does as well. And especially since at the Jewish Unity Through Diversity Institute, we encourage people to explore the greater Jewish heritage. This just works so well with what we do. So I'm excited to be a part of it. And I'm excited to have this conversation with Dalia. So I will hand the floor over to Dalia at this point, and we'll talk after.
Hi there. Thank you for having me. I think it's wonderful that I'm with Drora and Dora that are really all about unifying diversity. And I think that one of the themes in this book of Caravan of Hope is diversity and unity as well. It really fits in my life and the way that I was raised. So it really speaks to me. Right here. This is the cover of the book. If you can see, just looking at the cover, is that it looks like a distant land going into the city with a plane. And that's kind of like the story of my mother's life, coming from a faraway place in Central Asia, and then kind of like going into the city, from suburban to urban. That's kind of like where we're going with the photo and the cover of the book. The next slide is the map of Central Asia. So you'll see that the Emir of Bukhara, which was the Emir of Bukhara in the early 1900s, he coined the term Bukharians for people that came from Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, all of those Stan countries. He decided they're all Bukharians. So sometimes when you hear someone say I'm Bukharian, they may not be from Bukhara per se. They're from this these 5 states today that the emir coined the term for all of these citizens, Bukharian. So where Central Asia is, it's sandwiched between China on one side, on the west side, and then Turkey all the way to the left. And the Central Asia is the southern republics of Russia. That's what you're seeing over there. And they border Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, what is today Pakistan. My parents lived in all of these countries. They were floating like a motley crew through all of these countries, back and forth, persecuted, either for religion, conversions, for economics, confiscating everything that they owned. So Central Asian Jews tend to be very nomadic, and they kind of circulate between these countries. So I'm not from the capital. My family's not from the capital of Bukhara, but we actually mingled between Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran. So my family kind of went through all of those countries, and there was just a flow that you had to go through. It was a boomerang of back and forth and back and forth. Depends who was in power. And this went on for hundreds of years. What do we have as the next slide? Okay, this is one of the main characters. This is Dora, my grandmother. My middle name is Dora. We have a Dora here too. And my grandfather, Hasid. This is when they first got married in Soviet Uzbekistan, 1930s. We can move on. This is my mother is the top right. This is in Afghanistan. In the early 1940s. This is with her sisters. My grandmother's to the left, my grandfather's to the right. It's a growing family in Afghanistan. So immediately from Uzbekistan, my mother moved to Afghanistan, which we'll talk about how that came to be. What do we have as the next slide? This is my mother at 12 years old. She moved to Peshawar. Peshawar at the time was British India. Today it's its own country. My mother is the top left. My father is in the middle. They didn't know one day they would marry. She was 12. My dad was 10 years older at the time. She went to Peshawar because she wanted anything and anyhow to get out of Afghanistan, which we'll talk about the situation in Afghanistan, what led her to Peshawar. We can go to the next slide. This is a very typical way that the people in Afghanistan had meals, sitting on a blanket, and you see that it's very communal. People live together in an area called a mahalla, which is the equivalent of kind of like a ghetto, perhaps. Maybe that's the best translation. It's a Jewish communal place that people lived. It's a close quarter. The kitchen was in the center of the courtyard. And people ate and sat together. And this is a very typical way of how my family and how the community sat down and had their meals. This is, again, a family photo in Afghanistan. My mother is the bottom left. My grandmother, you can see she's at the right. This is right before, from Afghanistan, this is right before they actually went to Israel. They moved to Israel from Afghanistan. And here in Israel, my mother is at the right, 1949. She came with all her sisters, 7 sisters, 1 brother. We can move through. This is my parents who got married in Israel in 1953. At the time, my father was living in Bombay, India, and my mother moved from Israel to Bombay in 1953. So he went and he got her and he brought her to India. So my mother's been through a lot of countries with my father. Next slide. This is my mother in India. One thing that comes across in the book is that my parents definitely ensconced themselves in the culture of wherever they were. So here my mother was very much into Indian culture and Indian dancing. And this is just a photo just to show that she did not live there like a foreigner, but she was definitely a part of the community. This is my great-grandparents' 100-year birthday party in Israel in 1963. This was a big event. They donated these two Sefer Torahs that you see. And these Sefer Torahs from 1963 came from Afghanistan, from my great-great-great-grandparents, who were a shamash in a synagogue in Afghanistan. And we actually lost these Torahs for about 20 some odd years. In the book, I go about talking about how my mother found these Torahs and she brought them back. She found them in Israel, but she brought them to two other countries, which we can talk about it later on. This is my grandmother, Dora, in Uzbekistan in 1966. She did not see her family from the time that she married my grandfather in the 1930s. She didn't see, this was the first time she saw her family in 30 some odd years. It was very emotional for her. My grandmother is the one sitting in the middle. She's the one that probably looks the most modern because she was living in America and she went to visit her family in Uzbekistan. You can continue. Finally, this is Pesach in Forest Hills, New York. My mother is at the top of the stairs. This is in the home that I grew up in Forest Hills, New York. This is with all her sisters. Pesach is very festive. There is something that they're wearing called a joma, which is a silk brocade robe that you put on for special occasions. Pesach was one of those special occasions. That's what you'll see over there. It's gold with embroidery. I don't know if we have any more slides. Everything was always done together, I think. Yeah. Okay, super.
So thank you very much for that. I think now we have the main characters in the book, if you want, if we call it that. And if you notice, a lot of it focuses on women. I'm talking to the audience now. A lot of the book itself focused on women, and I saw the whole book when I was reading it as these powerful women in your family. And just to start the story, Dora gives birth in a Russian prison. She must have had some incredible survival skills. She was alone in this prison. So did you always feel this kind of female power? Usually, I don't know, personally, I think of Bukharian families as a patrilineal society, and that's
Right.
not what you're describing here. Can you talk about that a little?
Yes. I think that we have to put this in perspective. So the way that it worked is in Central Asia, the men left their families into caravans, thereby the title. They were merchants. Central Asians are merchants. That's what they are. They're traders. And so they left their families. The women were by themselves and they had to keep each other company and they had to be very resourceful. So the women, what also separated my grandmother from really her peers in Afghanistan, because although she was Bukharian, we really go, the book starts off where she moves to Afghanistan and she felt like she went backwards from Bukhara. She went backwards. Afghanistan was very backwards for her. And she was a very educated woman, which was very unusual. So I think that already there, that set her apart from everybody else. But you asked me about the women being very strong. Yes, she raised them very independent, not to rely on a man because she couldn't rely on her husband because he was traveling so much. Also, her life started out a little bit challenging because I discuss in the book how at 16 years old, my grandmother's father was taken away to Siberia to die in the gulag. So she saw a lot of tragedy and she had to be self-reliant. And she raised her girls. It just so happens that she had 7 girls and 1 boy. She raised her girls to be very resilient and very strong to protect them against anything that comes at them. My aunts, when they moved to America in the 1950s, all became entrepreneurial, all extremely financially successful. And they're coming also from a place of, we have nothing to lose because we have nothing to lose and there's no fallback. So they were inherently very strong. I think also to live in Central Asia and come from that DNA, with hundreds of years of persecution, makes you resilient as well. And the women, like I said, oftentimes were alone.
They were alone, and yet you also describe the hospitals that don't allow women to come into them. So they had to also be resourceful in terms of medicine, I would think, as well.
Yeah,
Can you
it's
talk a
very
little
true.
bit about that?
Yes. So in my mother, after my grandmother was incarcerated in Soviet Uzbek in the early 1930s, she gave birth to my mother. Um, she moves to Afghanistan. They were smuggled out to Afghanistan from there, and at a young age of 8, 9 years old, my mother developed diphtheria, and girls are not allowed to go to hospitals. Now, there's a few things you should know. Till today, Afghanistan does not allow girls to go to school. That's how backwards of a country it is. Number two, because of the lack of schools, there are no doctors that can go to school. So there are no medical doctors. The way you had to go about it through spit and wit, basically, and go to like the local bazaar and get basically some snake oil sometimes for your ailments. Um, Again, mothers had to be resourceful. Whiskey was used very commonly for pain, like alcohol, it was used, to clean wounds. That's really what they had. So, one of the things that I talk about in the book is how my mother, as a girl with diphtheria who was going to die, could not go to a hospital.
Right. And then there's another scene where another member dresses up as a boy, but I'll let people read the book for that
Oh, so
one.
I'll share that. Okay, so
Oh,
what
okay.
happened
It's up
is
to
the
you.
way I'll share that. I'll share that. So actually, the way that my mother got treatment because she was going to die, there was no way to save her, was the only doctors, interestingly enough, that were in Afghanistan were German doctors. And Germany had an incentive to have German doctors in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a landlocked country. And the way to get to the British, who they were against, and they were in India. So they came to Afghanistan, the Germans. Um, and so my grandmother called a German doctor who happened to be very nice. And the quick thinking that he had was because he knew he cannot take her into the hospital, and my grandmother couldn't even escort her into a hospital. My grandmother couldn't even go. Is let's cut her hair and say she's a boy. And she was young enough and flat chested enough to pass as a boy and put on her cousin's clothes, boy clothes, and they actually brought her to the hospital as a boy. But my grandmother could not go with my mother. They sent the help, who was a male, because to stay with my mother and make sure that nobody discovered that she was a girl. So she stayed there for a few days. That was the situation. If it wasn't for that ingenious flicker of an idea, we don't, obviously what would have been, she would have died.
So let's talk a little bit more about the oppression that they went through and how they dealt with it. And I think we can relate to it in terms of the language when a lot of my focus was on Dora in prison. So when she's finally released from prison and she arrives in Herat, her husband, Hasid, immediately warns her not to speak in Russian. So what are the nuances in culture and language between Russian and Bukharan?
Okay. First of all, the reason why he warned her not to speak in Russian is because Afghanistan viewed the Bukharian Jews as Soviet spies. So he said, no, you cannot speak Russian here in Afghanistan. That's number one. Number two, Bukhara as a language, it is based on classical Persian with a large number of Hebrew loan words, just like Yiddish has a lot of loan words as well, very similar, and a small number of loan words also from the surrounding areas, surrounding languages as well. So there is also some Russian in Bukhari. The difference in the way that it sounds, Bukhari sounds a lot more Tajik, a lot more cut than Russian. I don't know how best I can describe it, but like I said, Bukhari is is based on classical Persian. So that's where it's different than Russian. Most Bukharians, though, did speak Russian. And like I said, Afghanistan viewed Bukharians and Russians as Soviet spies. So they had to be very weary.
Yeah, so there's all this different oppression and all these different things going on there. And
Right.
I know that people listening are probably trying to follow, and it's because there is so much going on. So I want to give us a little bit of a overview. Again, I want people to read the details in the book, but if you can just tell us the steps between Herat and New York, and then we'll get a little bit more into the story in New York.
The steps of, tell me what you mean between Herat and New York. Tell me what you mean exactly.
Oh, the traveling, how they got between Herat and New York.
Oh boy. Okay, so in
Herat, in short, yes, we want people to read the book.
Herat again went through. Herat is in Afghanistan and it borders Iran. When my mother was released from prison, they went to Herat in Afghanistan, which was very backwards. So from Herat, they went to Kabul. From Kabul, and I'm just making it very short right now, from Kabul, my mother went to Peshawar. My mother was always pushing herself forward. When the state of Israel was born in 1948, she said, we have to move to Israel. So they moved to Israel. And that was actually when the large exodus left Afghanistan. She was the first bus out of Afghanistan. They went through Iran. And then when they land in Israel, she meets my father. Again, she met him in Peshawar when she was 12 years old, but she meets him again now. She gets married in Israel. They moved to Bombay. From Bombay in 1956, they moved to New York. So that's how we end up in New York.
And so I needed everybody to follow that. First of all, just thinking about what's going on in today's day and age, the concept that Iran was the safest way to go, I'm just putting that out there. We don't have to get into it unless somebody wants to bring it up later. But let's get now to New York, because I think it's an interesting concept of Bukharian community in New York. And Zina then in the US establishes a home to welcome refugees and those who need help. So again, another very strong woman. Can you tell us a bit about the community they established in New York, or they helped establish?
So what's interesting is when my parents moved to New York in the 1950s, there was virtually no Bukharian Jews, and there was virtually no Afghan Jews. And they were looking to, and her sisters were still in Israel. So they moved to Rego Park in New York. They bought a home over there. And my mother and my father immediately helped my grandparents buy a home right next to them. And then my mother's sisters started to move to New York. This is how really the community started. There was no Bukharian community at all in the 1950s. They immediately said, we want to have a synagogue. So they went and they started a synagogue on the Sephardi Jewish congregation of Queens. Wherever they went, their focus was, let's build a community. Wherever they went. In India, they did the same thing. And we'll talk a little bit further along, because New York was not the last stop for them. They kept on moving still, but wherever they went, they built a community. They felt a responsibility. They also know inherently, these Bukharian Jews know inherently, without a community, you can't build anything. We need each other. We need to be interdependent. They knew that inherently. That's their way that they survived for hundreds of years. One of the differences also is that living in Central Asia, no one assimilated. The Jews are together. There is no assimilation, which actually is their salvation, that they didn't assimilate. So they huddle in together, and they understood that for us to continue in America, we need to build a community. And that's what they did. And they built this synagogue in Forest Hills, which is still functioning today. And what they did is my mother brought her sisters to New York. They got married. My father's family business initially employed the husbands. It ended up being a very big business, helping everybody. And that was the idea. You had to help everybody. Family came and lived with us. We had a very large home so that people can live with us. Even for a year, they would live with us. until they could establish themselves and move out and then and that's how the community started, slowly, slowly. And today we have this, the biggest Bukharian community outside of Israel is in New York.
And that it's interesting. One of the things I picked up in the book is that you have this very rich heritage, this very strong Jewish connection. Like you said, there's no assimilation. And then you talk about not quite fitting into the schools in New York as someone of a non-Ashkenazi heritage. So I think you need to mention that a little.
So imagine it's 1970s in New York. And if you can imagine what it was like back then, really, I was in an Ashkenazi yeshiva. They really did not know. And they called me Sephardi when I'm really not Sephardi. I'm really a Mizrahi Jew. That's already a misnomer over there. So the sad thing is that we were considered the other in the Ashkenazi school, and generally amongst Ashkenazim, they didn't really know who and what we were. We seemed very foreign to them. Definitely don't look like them. We're darker, my curly hair, and so I didn't fit in because even though I was born and raised in New York, they put me into a kind of ESL class with immigrants from first grade to eighth grade. And I had no idea what I was doing there. And they did that to nearly all these Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews. I was with people that didn't speak English, even though I was born and raised in New York. So they definitely saw us as the other, primitive, uneducated, which, by the way, was my mother's experience when she moved to Israel. That was how she felt as well when she moved to Israel, that they viewed her as this dark other foreigner coming from Central Asia. There was, they put their nose up. So I had that same experience when I went to elementary school here in New York. And it was definitely traumatic for me. It definitely left an impact for me. I didn't understand it. I didn't know differences until it was pointed out to me that I'm different.
Right, like I said, you came from this very rich Jewish heritage, and it doesn't make a difference what color you are. It's just the Jewish heritage. And what even amazes me more, you mentioned that New York isn't the end of your family's journey. And so let's go to the next step, because I'm going to let you tell the story of Bangkok, because I don't think people would believe it if I started. How's that?
So what's interesting, like I said, about Central Asian Jews is that they tend to be, and the book titled Caravan of Hope, because I said that they're merchants. But what separated my family in particular to the rest of their cohort is that they were travelers and they were fearless. So being that they were from Central Asia, they did not find it, if they found business in Bangkok, Thailand. And because the family business was in gem colored stones in the 1960s, so my father and my brother, my father and my uncle, his brother, they opened up an office in Bangkok in the 1960s. It's dirt roads. There are no Jews at all, no Jews. And they went there and they said, we're going to build a Jewish community in Bangkok, which is pretty incredible. This is before Bangkok was ever on the map. And I'm sure you know, if you live in Israel, how many Israelis go to Bangkok after the army. It is a destination. It was not like that. So they went there, they built a community. What they did is, because they were looking for, so they established themselves. And the way that it worked is that my father lived 6 months of the year in New York, 6 months of the year in Bangkok. And they had a building. It was a gem broker house, and they were supplying colored stones all over the world to people weren't traveling. So I just want to put this in perspective. In the 1960s, people are not flying. It's a very unusual thing still. But for my family, the world was flat. They didn't care. So they're living over there. And the way that they decided to build a Jewish community is my father and the business needed people to work for them. And so what they did is they hired family members from Israel to come and live in Bangkok. And that is how the community started. So only the Israelis were adventurous enough to say, sure, I'll go to Israel. They got married, they bring their spouse, they move to Bangkok, and this community slowly starts to grow. Simultaneously, my parents are hosting it. They are in the Jewish travel guide at the time. If you want anything Jewish, to contact my parents in Bangkok, Thailand, and they're listed. Zena and Yehuda Abraham is the people to contact for free Shabbat meals. Every Friday night and Saturday, my parents are hosting free Shabbat meals. So I would see anywhere between 50 to 100, 200 people at these free Shabbat meals. And they started to grow this community. So what happens is, should I share of how Chabad ended up there?
I think so. I think especially the mikvah.
Yeah. That's a pretty incredible story. So imagine now it's 1960s. We're going through the 70s. My family's still there. The community's slowly growing, but it's still very slow. It's mostly just travelers.
Before you get into Chabad, I just want to point out one thing quickly, is that you mentioned before that the Bukharian community has been merchants, and this is a continuation of that culture, is what it seemed like to me, right? The Silk Road, the Jews working with Jews, the shared culture, the shared languages. So this
and fearless
to us, and fearless.
Fearless. I'll go anywhere. It's just fearless, which is, I think, what made them so resilient and so strong. So what happens is we're going through 60s, 70s, 80s, late 80s. My parents are in New York, and their rabbi in New York says, I want to introduce you to the Chabad Lubavitch Rebbe, Rabbi Schneerson. I want to introduce you to him. So at the time, if you remember, if anyone remembers, if anyone's been at 770 Eastern Parkway, the Rebbe used to give out $1 to everyone that used to come on Sunday. He used to give $1 to everyone and give them a blessing. So my parents were online on a Sunday to go meet the Rebbe, and they said to the Rebbe, we live in Bangkok. He said, whatever he said, he gave them a blessing, he gave them $1. 2 minutes later, his shaliach is running after my parents and saying, come back. Rabbi Schneerson wants to talk to you. And he says, do you have a mikvah in Bangkok? And my parents said, no. And it's totally not, believe it or not, it's totally not even in their culture, the mikvah, believe it or not. They're traditional Jews, but mikvah coming from Russia, it was not a thing for them. So they said no. And he said, here's $5, go build one. That is exactly what happened. And they took it very seriously. It took 14 years for them to build the first and only mikvah in Bangkok that still exists today. It's called Mikvah Rachel in Bangkok. And once they came back to the Rebbe and said that the mikvah was built, did the Rebbe feel he could send the shluchim, Chabad, in 1994, the first Chabad was established. And it started with making sure that there was a mikveh there first, which my parents made sure that it was built. And then the community started from there. Now there's like 5, 6 Chabads, I think, all over Thailand.
Yeah, and there are plenty of people, like you said, from Israel going after the army and from around the world. So it's just incredible to me that this Bukharian family traveled around and built the first Chabad mikveh in Thailand. Just everybody think about that for a little bit as we continue. So I want to also mention that the book is really readable. It's a great story because it opens with Zena telling her story at the local synagogue and referring to a Caravan of Hope. And then at the end of the book, you kind of sum it up with that as well. So I think you mentioned a little bit about the Caravan of Hope and what it means. Is there anything else you want to make sure that we get before we go on to the questions from the audience?
From Caravan of Hope? No, I think it's so, like I said, the title of the book was inspired just by, I think I wanted to explain how these are, they traveled by caravans. And that, you know, that my mother is like always looking at the big city. And the hope is that she always was actively pursuing her future. She definitely was actively, and that's very, very key. She was actively, just by the way that my parents moved to Thailand. I mean, wherever they were, they felt a responsibility to build a Jewish community. And these are not people that are educated. They just said they have a will, they're going to make it happen. And I think that's a very powerful message, that you can make anything happen. You don't need an education. You'll figure it out, but you need to have that strong desire and conviction. Something I'm very proud of that they did. They also, by the way, the other thing is that when my mother, one small thing as well, is that speaking of community, when my mother moved to India, she didn't sit in India. I showed you the picture of my mother in the Indian dress, which we still have. It's coins. It's actually coins,
Oh, wow.
what you're looking at. It's easily 100 pounds, this dress. It's crazy heavy. She immediately got herself involved in the Indian Jewish community. And no one from India at the time went to Israel. So my mother became the first woman to lead Indian Jews to Israel on a kind of Indian heritage, a Jewish heritage, Israel heritage. So my mother led the first Hadassah group to Israel. So it's just another example. These are people that are not educated, but they're just put their shoulders back, and they knew the importance of community and push forward, always look forward, which is another remarkable thing. I don't hear bitterness at all.
Right.
I don't hear bitterness because it's always about moving forward.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful way to go over to the audience questions, and we'll come back and let you sum it up at the end and talk a little bit about other things. But I want to make sure that some of the audience questions get in. Thank you, Dahlia. I'll hand it over to Dora.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dora, for these very interesting questions. And thank you, Dahlia, for answering everything. So far, I just see a few comments from people who actually were in one way or another in touch with your family or the synagogue. So I can just read those while we wait for
the
questions to come in. So there was a comment from Marion. I had relatives in Rego Park, and when I stayed with them in 1989, I came across the Bukharan synagogue, but in those days I had no idea about Bukhara. So it's just a little addition to what you described.
It's the largest, today Rego Park is the largest Bukharian Jewish community in America. It's the largest. They built a huge synagogue there. But like I said, when my parents moved in the 1950s, it virtually didn't exist. The mass exodus out of Bukhara was the 70s and the 90s. That's the mass exodus out of Bukhara. I think there's something like, I want to say 300,000 Jews, perhaps 300,000. It's a big community, more than you would think. And, one of the things I'll add as a side note is why I wrote the book is because growing up in the Ashkenazi school that I grew up, all I was taught was about European Jewish history, was about the Shoah. And my family was not represented at all. So I felt like this is something that I had to give for the Jewish world to have. If it wasn't for this story, because my mother is really the last generation, it was incumbent upon me now to share the story, because otherwise it would be lost. No one would know about this enclave that's been living there from the Babylonian expulsion. No one would know.
And like we said, there's so much to learn from it and to grow from it and to appreciate our own Jewish past and the Jewish present. So Thank you for doing it. Sorry, I'm interrupting again.
Yeah, happy to.
So, and there was another comment from Stephanie. I cannot wait to read the book. I grew up in your hood, and I remember my parents took me to your family synagogue so I would learn and experience other Jewish cultures besides our Ashkenazi. I remember well, it was beautiful. So
wow. Okay, super.
Comment that came. So, and there is a question, and I think this question connects well to the other pictures that you had on your slideshow. Any particular cultural elements like music and food that you can tell us about?
So if we go back to the slides, I can tell you something about the foods. Okay, my first book, because this is my fourth book, Caravan of Hope. My first book is called Silk Road Vegetarian, which is Bukharian food is typically a lot of meat and it's one pot dishes. And so I'm vegetarian and I took all of the recipes and I made them vegetarian, thereby the title Silk Road Vegetarian. But it's all of the Bukharian, Persian, Afghani dishes made. So here is one of the things that is very prevalent in a Bukharian mourner's home. It's called khushkilik. It is a round fried dough. I talk about it in the book, which is why I said, let me introduce it over here. The circular is always something, beginning and end. So this is something, a very traditional Bukharian fried pastry that a mourner's home will have. This is called khushkilik. And then the next one, this is called shirin polo. So any festive occasion always has some kind of currants, be it orange peel or mulberries or raisins or cherries. So whenever there is a happy occasion, shirin, I think it means happy. So this is actually a photo from my cookbook, shirin polo, it's rice with several different currants, orange peels, and slivered almonds. And for festive occasions, you're always going to find a sweet rice. What's also very prevalent about Central Asian cooking in general is that because they had large families and because they lived communally, the dishes are huge. It's one pot meals. That's the other thing. It's not like 10 different varieties. It's one big pot meals to feed a lot of people. That's the other thing as well. I don't think I had any other food dishes. Oh, this one is bakhsh. Okay, so this is a Bukharian dish made from dill, typically made with beef or chicken. I made it vegan with the lima beans over there, which some Persians do it as well. The Bukharians, Afghans, Persians, we have very similar dishes in color. Rice is definitely common for all of us. It depends on what was available in each country, and then everybody adjusted it. So the Bukharians were very much about beef. They love beef. They love mutton. They have caracal sheep over there. That's a very big industry. So this is a typical green rice that we would have on a Shabbat Friday night. And what you see over there, those big pieces over there, that's actually the bottom crust. It's called tardigi, but it's made from potatoes. It's delicious. And this is all in my cookbook, Silk Road Vegetarian. This is one of the last Pesachs with my father before he passed away in 2014. Like I said, our holidays are very festive. We wear these silk brocade jamas, and my father is also wearing the kippah over there that you can see. It's a gold brocade kippah, and we very much keep our cultures for festive occasions, anything happy. We put on these robes at weddings, Pesach, holidays. So that's why I wanted to show that picture. This is my parents as they got older.
Thank you so much for sharing this. And now I will look at the other questions that are coming in. Is the Bukharian community in Jerusalem impoverished? That's the next.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if the Jerusalem.
I want to say one thing about that. I just want to say one thing about that, if you don't mind. So the Bukharian community is not necessarily a Bukharian community at this point, but if you look at where they came to, which today is overrun by ultra-Orthodox communities, but the Bukharian neighborhood of Jerusalem had mansions there. People from Bukhara would have their summer homes in Jerusalem, and they were impoverished, not even close. After a while, yes, things started to go down, and then instead of one mansion being for one family, you'd have 10 to 15 families there in the house. But today, it's not necessarily. I don't think it's the same as in New York. There are still some synagogues, but it's very diverse. It's not one central community as much. So, but
I think in the early 1900s, the late 1800s, it was called Shkunat Bukhara.
It still is called that. It's just not Bukharian anymore. It's right now ultra-Orthodox, very complicated.
Right. So we didn't go, when we
fine.
went to Israel, when my mother went to Israel, she didn't go to Jerusalem. She went to Tel Aviv. And the area that she lived in was in the Florentine area, which at the time was a nothing neighborhood. Today, it's the most expensive neighborhood in Tel Aviv. But that's where she went. And most of the immigrants at the time that when my parents came, don't forget, there's so many people moving to Israel right after World War II. And they didn't have enough housing, or there are people that couldn't afford it. So there were a lot of people living in tents because there was no place to put them. Luckily, my family didn't have to live in a tent. They came with money to Israel, which is extremely unusual at that time, extremely unusual.
Right, and the Bukharan took in their own communities in the Shkunat Bukhara, in the Bukharan community in Jerusalem. It's just today it's no longer Bukharan; it's just called that. But sorry, continue.
Thank you. So if there are any other questions, we still have a little bit of time, so please feel free to put them there in the chat, or you can raise your hand as well. So another question also is the cultural element, if you can share a bit about music.
So I want to put this out there. Because my parents came in the 1950s, there was virtually not a Bukharian community and I was born in 1969. I was not around this Bukharian community. So I am not the typical Bukharian because I was not around it. We weren't raised with it because there was no community. So the only Bukharian music that I can share, and it's not like my parents listened to Bukharian music. That's the other thing that set my parents very different from their peers, is that they were always looking to move forward. Yes, mix with whoever was with them, but also my parents made concerted efforts to always have American friends. So I was not raised in this very Bukharian culture with this music. It's not like it was played at home, but there was a woman in my family who would go around and she would sing songs. So the one thing I do remember is that at a funeral, they would bring a woman to help the mourners cry. So she would sing a song that sounded like she was wailing to help the mourners cry. And that is the extent of my surrounding with Bukharian music. There is something, by the way, I forgot. There is something that my mother played at every festive occasion. It's called a doira. I didn't bring it down. I didn't bring it with me to show you, but what it is it's a drum. It's a big hand drum with rings on the inside, and you play it with your fingers. So this was played at all festive occasions, something that you needed a lot of dexterity with your fingers and strong fingers. Bukharian women also, they work with their hands, they have very strong fingers. So that was the extent of the music. My mother would always play this doira on a festive occasion.
Thank you. And I just want to tell everyone that if you do read the book, it's amazing how Dalia describes how they were living in these different places. I think it's really worth reading the descriptions also of that. So there are more questions coming in. You mentioned 2 books so far, The Caravan of Hope, and you mentioned the cookbook, the
Silk Road Vegetarian.
Silk Road Vegetarian. So what are the other books that you've written?
So my second book is called Spiritual Kneading, Kneading, Spiritual Kneading Through the Jewish Months, where it's connecting the challah to the look of the Jewish theme of the month. So every month the challah looks and tastes according to the Jewish theme of the month. That was my second book, Spiritual Kneading. My third book, called Necessary Mourning, Mourning. I wrote that book after my father passed away. It is the only book that I know of, which is why I wrote it, on the stages that the Jewish mourner goes through, but the psychological necessity of it. And I didn't, when my father passed away, I didn't find any book. The books that I read were all about do this and do that, or don't do this and do that. But what I started to understand is the psychological necessity of each stage and how it helped me psychologically go through the phases. And that's why I wrote that book. I'm also right now in process of writing my fifth book, which helped me write Caravan of Hope. I lived in my grandfather's apartment in 1998, and he passed away in 1997 at 100 years old. And he wrote his life story starting from 1897. He wrote his journal. And when I was looking for resources, I went to his journals to help me with resources with my mother's life in Caravan of Hope. And then I realized, as much as I thought I knew him, I really didn't know him, and I don't think anyone did. He had a fascinating, crazy life. I wish it becomes a movie. That's how good it was. So I'm in process of taking his journal and turning it into a book right now. And that is going to be called A Central Asian Merchant's Tale. And so, like I said, I got some of my resources I got from his journals, which, by the way, there is, I don't know, maybe a handful of journals in the world from that area. My grandfather was born in Merv, Turkmenistan in 1897. There's very little first person account of someone writing their life story. And there's a reason for it. And by the way, there's a reason why I wrote Caravan of Hope, because anything out there on Bukharian Jewry is written by a man, and it's written from a man's perspective. And there is no novel on Bukharian Jews, and let alone on a Jewish woman. So I wanted this book to have a much broader appeal to women, that there is a strong message here. And I wanted Bukhara to be more in the background and the theme of my mother's life and what she accomplished more in the foreground.
Thank you. There are two related questions that I'll read together. Do the current Bukharians look to integrate with Ashkenazi Jews in Rego Park or Forest Hills? And have you and your family assimilated married non-Mizrahi men?
The Bukharian community today in Rego Park is a very tight-knit community. In general, they do not assimilate. In general, they don't. They definitely keep to themselves, and they love their culture. As far as my family, like I said, because we came here in the 50s and there was no community, and we were not raised with Bukharians, we were not raised with Afghans, we were kind of on our own. We all married out. Jewish, but we all married out. We all did.
Hence
there was
decline.
yeah, hence, yes. Hence decline, yes.
And then I see another question here. My son will be spending the summer in Thailand. Is there somewhere he can contact to experience the Jewish community in Bangkok?
Absolutely. The Chabad of Bangkok. It's a young, thriving, it's a blast. And there's kosher food there. Today, there's not the Chabad that my parents ended up starting. The synagogue that they started is called Even Chen, and that was in the business district in Bangkok. Today, there's in Bangkok alone, I think 2-3 Chabads, but it started with this one synagogue that became Chabad, but originally it was the synagogue that my parents started. And Even Chen, if you know Hebrew, it means warm stone, because there's a big gem industry business over there. And Chabad now, there's another Chabad, which is more for younger people, because the Chabad where my parents started, Even Chen, it's more for people that live there, the local Jews that live over there. But I think anyone traveling wants to go to the other Chabad in Khao San. I think that was the name of the street, Khao San. But very easy, just look up Chabad in Bangkok. And there's kosher food there as well.
Thank you very much. And there is another comment from Rebecca. My cousin is married to a Bukhari, very patriarchal family. As the only son and the youngest, he is idolized. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
I think this is the Jewish thing with their sons. I don't know if it's just Bukharians. It's my son. So my uncle was the only boy from 7 girls, so he was treated 100% very differently, and I speak about it in the book as well. But the women in my family are real powerhouses, this I have to say.
Thank you. I don't see now more questions. I hope everyone got their questions answered. And if you haven't, then read the book. It's really worth it. And we're, of course, as always, tomorrow we will send out follow-up information with, of course, the links to where to find this book and also Dalia's other books. And you will also receive this recording. So if you didn't see the full talk, then you can watch it tomorrow or whenever you want. So I think I will just pass back to Dora and Dalia for some closing words before we wrap up today's session.
Well, I want to say thank you very much. And like you kept saying, the concept that we are a diverse people. And I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind. So if there's one takeaway you want to make sure people have from today or from the book or from their Jewish heritage, what would you say? And we'll end on that note.
I'll say it in one sentence. I mean, I would say live a life of sharing, have fun, make your life a legacy worth writing about. That's what I would say.
I love that. I think that's brilliant, actually. So thank you. And thank you, Dora and Sebastian. And
thank you.
All
thank you for
coming.
hosting this. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. I
look
hope
forward to seeing everybody next time.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dalia, for sharing your story. It was really wonderful to hear
Thank
about.
You. Thank you very much. Thank you. I hope you enjoy the book too.
I did very much, and I recommend it to everyone. And thank you, everyone,
Me as well.
for being here. And we will be in touch tomorrow. Our next two talks are going to be this Thursday. We have a talk about the Jews of Panama. And then on Sunday about Jewish Barcelona. Of course, we'll send out also our upcoming events so you can read and see what we have in store for the upcoming weeks. So thank you everyone for being here, and we wish you a wonderful rest of the day or night if you are in that side of the world.
Thank you. Thank you, Dora and Dora. D&D.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.